Around the world today, there's a quiet crisis shaping the future of global finance. It isn't war, inflation, or a tech collapse, it's debt. Governments from Washington to Tokyo, London to Rome, have built a dependence on borrowing so deep, some experts warn we may be trapped in a financial addiction with no easy escape. In developed nations, the ratio of public debt to GDP has climbed back to levels last seen at the end of World War II. That's not just striking, it's unprecedented in modern times. For decades, borrowing was manageable, almost taken for granted. But today, with interest rates climbing and inflation pressing on every economy, that reliance on debt has become a looming threat. Investors have been sounding the alarm for years. They warn that governments have grown comfortable issuing debt, almost treating it as an endless resource. But what happens when borrowing becomes too costly? When interest payments rise faster than a nation's income, when the spiral of debt begins to squeeze essential spending, the system starts showing cracks. Today, many nations are addicted to debt. It's a problem that can emerge anywhere without warning. From the financial collapse of 2008 to the Eurozone struggles, history has shown how quickly it can escalate. As debt piles up and interest payments consume budgets, governments lose flexibility. The spiral begins, subtle at first, then unstoppable, leaving few clear paths to escape. This is what economists call the debt trap. Governments borrow to cover deficits, then borrow more to pay the interest on existing debt. Bonds become both the solution and the risk. Investors lend, governments pay interest, and yet the cycle continues. Bond yields are the heartbeat of the system. When yields rise, borrowing costs rise. If they climb too fast, the economy can be crushed under the weight of interest payments. This is the domain of the so-called bond vigilantes, investors who monitor government fiscal discipline and respond by selling bonds if they sense reckless spending. As debt grows, interest payments begin to dominate the budget. Every dollar spent on servicing old obligations is a dollar taken from schools, infrastructure, or social programs. When borrowing is needed just to pay the interest on previous debt, the system starts to tilt. That's when the spiral begins. Subtle at first, then relentless, pulling governments deeper into a cycle that becomes harder and harder to escape. For decades, governments have borrowed almost as if debt were free. The era of near zero or negative interest rates encouraged this habit. Borrowing wasn't just cheap, it was practically rewarded. But those days are over. Inflation has returned, interest rates are higher, and suddenly the cost of sustaining debt is painfully visible. Shocks like the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and global conflicts have forced governments into the role of the insurer of last resort. Massive spending programs were justified, necessary even, yet the result is an enormous debt load, roughly equivalent to the entire annual output of many major economies. For decades, the world ran on cheap debt. It was easy, convenient, almost invisible, an addiction few wanted to admit. Now, with interest rates climbing, the cracks are showing. Borrowing is no longer free, and the cost of that addiction is impossible to ignore. Economists warn that governments need to rein in spending, shrink deficits, and face the consequences. But in politics, caution is rare. Rewards, promises to voters, and the pressure to spend make restraint almost unthinkable. The tension between fiscal reality and political desire is playing out on a global stage, quietly, relentlessly, and with enormous stakes. And it isn't just the US, Japan, Canada, Italy, France, all carry historically high debt loads. In some countries, private debt compounds the problem. The interconnection of government and private borrowing means that financial shocks can ripple faster and wider than ever. Take the financial shocks. Last year, the federal government spent $880 billion just on interest payments, more than it spent on defense and almost as much as healthcare. Deficits hover around 6 to 7% of GDP in peacetime, extraordinary levels by historical standards. The U.S. Treasury market, the backbone of the global financial system, is so large and influential that even small tremors here ripple worldwide. History is full of lessons. The bond vigilantes of the 1970s punished governments that borrowed recklessly. Yet today, central banks wield immense power, often overriding market pressures. Japan's experience demonstrates that a determined central bank can maintain stability even with staggering debt, keeping yields artificially low and creditors largely domestic. But in the West, the situation is far more precarious. In 2022, the UK's bond market experienced a dramatic episode under the Truss government, where reckless fiscal policy caused yields to spike, mortgage costs to soar, and markets to panic. The message was clear. Even small missteps can trigger immediate and painful consequences. For generations, government bonds were the bedrock of trust, the promise that your money was safe, backed by the full faith of the state. But that promise is being tested. In an era where inflation refuses to fade and debt piles keep growing, even the safest assets begin to tremble. Confidence once taken for granted now moves with every headline, every auction, every whisper of doubt. Because when governments owe too much and money itself loses value, the question isn't just about returns, it's about trust. Debt, of course, isn't always a villain. Wars, pandemics, or major crises justify borrowing. Yet the problem arises when borrowing becomes routine, when governments assume that tomorrow's revenue can always cover today's promises. That habit has created what some experts call a structural dependency on debt, a system where borrowing is no longer a tool, but a necessity. The mechanics are simple. Every dollar borrowed by the government becomes a dollar saved elsewhere in the economy. Deficits create private sector surpluses, but if those deficits grow too large, they risk overwhelming both markets and policy options. Government debt never stands alone. It's just one half of a much larger equation. When households, corporations, and the state all borrow heavily at the same time, the system becomes fragile. Booms built on private credit can look unstoppable until they aren't. Because when private bubbles burst, governments step in, absorbing the damage, taking the losses, and adding them to their own balance sheets. History repeats itself with haunting precision. Every private collapse leaves behind a mountain of public debt. Across the globe, governments face rising demands, aging populations, infrastructure needs, climate transition costs, and security concerns. At the same time, interest rates are climbing, inflation is returning, and growth remains fragile. All this means borrowing pressures will only intensify. Economists warn that the bond market may yet assert its power. Historically, bond vigilantes ensured fiscal discipline. Today, their role is debated. Central banks can override them, but not indefinitely. And if markets lose faith, borrowing costs could spiral, triggering a cascade of economic shocks. The real question now is simple. How high can yields rise before they start breaking the economy itself? Once upon a time, markets were supposed to discipline reckless governments. The so-called bond vigilantes kept them honest. But in the age of modern central banks, that pressure can be delayed, at least for a while. And at the center of it all stands the United States, the anchor of the global financial system, yet also its biggest debtor. Its debt sets the world's benchmark. Its deficits ripple across continents. Still, politics in Washington rewards borrowing, with tax cuts, massive spending, and promises meant to win votes today. The bill? That's a problem left for tomorrow. Other nations face their own dilemmas. Germany, long cautious in borrowing, has begun investing heavily in defense and infrastructure, effectively joining the global debt party. France and Italy, with high debt ratios, balance fiscal responsibility with political realities. The Eurozone is stronger than some think, but cohesion is fragile. So is there a solution? Economists debate. Some argue for austerity and spending cuts. Others suggest controlled inflation over time to reduce the real burden of debt. Some say the problem is overblown. After all, governments can issue currency, unlike households. But inflationary solutions come at a political cost, often unpalatable to voters. What's clear is this: debt is not going away. It has been a central feature of economies for centuries, enabling governments to invest, stabilize, and grow nations. But the modern addiction, amplified by decades of cheap money and crisis-driven spending, presents a unique challenge. Governments may continue to borrow, markets may continue to lend, and central banks may intervene. Yet the questions remain: how far can this spiral go? At what point will the bond vigilantes, or reality itself, force a reckoning? And can policymakers navigate the delicate balance between borrowing for today and preserving stability for tomorrow? Debt has been the lifeblood of modern economies, but like any addiction, it carries risks. What has started as a tool for growth has become a structural dependency. How the world manages this tension may well define the financial landscape for generations to come.